Bandwidth for changelog is provided by Fastly. Learn more at fastly.com. We move fast and fix things here at changelog because of Rollbar. Check them out at rollbar.com. And we're hosted on Linode servers. Head to linode.com/changelog. This episode is brought to you by Rollbar. Move fast and fix things. Resolve errors in minutes and deploy with confidence. Head to rollbar.com/changelog. Request a demo. Get started today. It's loved by developers, trusted by enterprises, and most of all, we use it here at changelog. Move fast and fix things with Rollbar. Once again, rollbar.com/changelog. Welcome to JS Party, a weekly celebration of JavaScript and the web. Tune in live on Thursdays at 1 p.m. U.S. Eastern at changelog.com/live. Join the community and Slack with us in real time during the shows. Head to changelog.com/community. Follow us on Twitter. We're at JSPartyFM. And now on to the show.
All right. Hey there. Welcome to JS Party, where every week we are throwing a party about JavaScript. And today we're going to be talking about JavaScript tooling with three awesome panelists. I'm K-Ball. I'll be your MC. So I'm going to introduce the panelists. Each one of you say hi as I introduce you and what your favorite or most irreplaceable piece of JavaScript tooling is. So first off, we got Nisi.
Hello. Alert.
Next, we've got Alex Sexton.
Hi, everyone. Probably Moment.js.
And then Chris Hiller.
Would it be cheating to say Mocha?
I don't know if that's cheating. You made it, man.
No, I didn't.
I think cheating is immutable, right? That's pretty irreplaceable.
I'm going to go with NPM. I think that's somewhat irreplaceable.
Irreplaceable. All right. So before we get started, I want to make you all feel comfortable with being ridiculous. So I'm gonna lay down a challenge to Jared. Jared started off JS Party with a rap at one point, so I prepared a little rap to intro you guys, and it's terrible. Just to throw that out there, it's terrible. But after this, no matter what you say, you know you're less ridiculous than I was. All right? So we're going to start. We got Nisi's the man from Nebraska JS, organizing conferences for the rest of us. If your talk was denied, you could probably blame him, but he wins major cred because he talks about Vim. Next, Alex Sexton. He's a real star, proudly representing the JS Party old guard, leading the way with Modernizer and jQuery, keeping it real down in Austin, the River City. My man Chris Hiller calls himself Bone Skull. His test framework keeps you from extraneous nulls. If you check his site, your opinion may worsen because he describes himself as a lizard person. Last but not least, the voice you've been hearing. Through today's episode, I'm the one who'll be steering, helping things along if they start to stall. Your MC, pleased to meet you. I go by K-Ball.
Amazing.
Word.
All right, so let's kick off segment one talking about build tooling. So JavaScript in particular didn't have to worry about builds. And a lot of folks who have been in this world for a long time and they went to the back end, they're coming back to the front and they're like, what the heck is all this stuff? There's so many different things. So we got a few different things that go into a modern build setup. You've got Babel, you got Webpack, Rollup, Parcel now, all these different module bundlers. People have been using Gulp and Grunt for a long time. So what are these things? What are you using? And what is it that somebody needs to know about build tooling today with JavaScript?
I don't think really anything. Should just all work out of the box. No decisions to be made. So I think we just close up shop.
Everybody wants to use the latest and greatest JavaScript. And because you probably have to support IE 11, you're not going to get that. So you need something like Babel to compile or transpile your code. And so that's part of the build tooling. Of course, people don't usually just use Babel. They will, couple that with like a Webpack or something and concatenate a bunch of files together and minify them or split them out in certain ways. And but so it used to be people used like Gulp and Grunt to do this sort of thing. And nowadays it's all Webpack and Parcel and that sort of thing.
Anybody still using Gulp and Grunt? I know I actually have some projects that I use Gulp with still.
Yeah, I'm still using Grunt.
I'm not creating new projects with either of those tools, but there are several that exist currently.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of felt like, well, there was Grunt and then everybody's using Grunt, and then there was Gulp, and then nobody used Grunt anymore, and everybody used Gulp, and then Webpack killed both of them. But yeah, lots of people still use these things. It's just that Grunt really kind of it really languished for quite a while. I remember it was at version 0.4 or what have you for a couple of years before it got to 1.0, and so that can really kind of hurt a project's momentum.
Maybe let's discuss a little bit about what we used to do with Grunt and Gulp, and how that's been replaced with more modern tooling. So, like the main benefits of a build is obviously to build your files together to serve them in a more efficient way to the browser, and so that includes things like concatenating them and then minifying them so that you have the smallest bundle possible. But maybe let's build on that and talk about how it's changed for today's JavaScript environment.
What if we even step further back? What did you guys do before, like Grunt, like before we had JavaScript task runners? I think I was pretty on board with makefiles, which essentially just like run shell scripts eventually. Makefiles and like to do dev watching stuff, you had to kind of, I guess there wasn't really watching things that I remember now that I think about it. But like you would use like Python simple server or something like that to get a dev server, and then there was no really transpilation, so we didn't need as much like runtime build.
I think the first thing that introduced me to the concept of watching was CSS preprocessors, so Sass.
Yeah.
I was in the Ruby world, and I remember when the Rails asset pipeline came out, and it would, in dev mode, it would literally recompile every time you did a page load. So it would go through all of your assets and redo it. It was slow as all get out, but the idea that I could make changes and then just refresh the page and it was there was phenomenal.
The asset pipeline was also interesting because it didn't have dependencies as part of the system or whatever. So like no matter what, it compiled and built everything in every folder of your like JavaScript app or whatever. So if you had anything you weren't using, it still would have to like run through all that stuff. I remember cleaning plenty of those up.
Well, and that actually gets into one of the key reasons behind the move from Gulp and Grunt to Webpack is that we now actually have true kind of dependency management, and we can do analysis and actually build out these trees.
Yeah. Did any of you guys use Broccoli in between the Grunt and Webpack kind of days by any chance?
Only embedded in Ember CLI, and I never got that deep into Ember. I played around with it. I mean, I remember at that time one of the big pitches for Broccoli was, well, Gulp and Grunt are actually task runners. Broccoli's specifically designed to be a build tool, and I think that's one of the big changes we've got going to Webpack, Rollup, and Parcel is they are also in a lot of ways conceptually build tools.
Yeah, I felt like Webpack didn't really catch up to Broccoli in terms of like dependencies and all that kind of stuff until much later in its, like after it was already popular. And these days it does just fine, but I thought Broccoli was really ahead of its time. I'm kind of sad that Jolis kind of stopped working on it at the time, and Ember eventually picked it back up, but it was fast, and it has like caching like down, like all the stuff that Happy Pack does for Webpack kind of was built into the nature of Broccoli. I think a lot of it got a lot of things right because it just stole a lot of stuff from Make, and I think that was generally a good thing. I don't know, it was a good project. Very difficult to spell. Try to spell Broccoli right on the first try. 2 L's, 2 C's, no one knows.
Did it do well with non-JavaScript assets? Because one of my frustrations, at least with earlier versions of Webpack, I haven't tried this with 4, but Webpack was really slow for no apparent reason at compiling Sass. So like for mostly static projects, I would actually still use Gulp because for some reason the Sass compilation was 2 times faster than with Webpack.
Yeah, I wonder if Webpack was using the JavaScript compiler versus the native one or something like that. I don't know why it would be different except for caching. Yeah, but Broccoli was somewhat agnostic to exactly what you were compiling. So if there was a JavaScript program that could compile something and output kind of an asset from the thing that, the input and the output, it could cache that and then make it very fast. Because it worked like on a dependency tree level, it could cache very like finite parts of the dependency tree, and then when something changed, it would only recompile the things that were leaf nodes of that dependency. And because of that, it is very fast. And that's somewhat what Happy Pack tries to implement on top of Webpack these days, which is good. If you need a speed up in your Webpack, and if you work at a semi-large company and have a large app, you probably could use one. Happy Pack is a pretty big win. The other big win that I think we got at Stripe for dev mode stuff is like turn off minification in dev mode. I think a lot of people have that on just because you just run everything in dev mode, but you don't really need it. It's nice to test eventually, maybe run your tests against the minified version, but it takes a really long time to minify JavaScript, so don't do it in dev mode.
Speaking of speed, I mean, it seemed to me that at least half of the reason that Gulp became popular and people were switching away from Grunt was the knock on Grunt was that it was very slow. There was I think a module that you could pull in that would make it somewhat faster, but with certain restrictions, where it would only run the plugins that you are actually going to use instead of trying to load everything up. And I think that's why it was slow. It took forever to load because it had to find and configure all these different plugins, even if you weren't going to run any of them. And of course, the other part of that holy war was, convention and configuration. Man, people got upset about that stuff.
Grunt was much more pleasurable to write than Gulp, in my opinion.
Oh, wow. I was totally the opposite. I liked Gulp way better. I prefer code over massive JSON files, and because the sort of piping nature of it, rather than having to figure out how was I going to write these things to this file and then read them and write them and read them. Like the communication via the file system that Grunt had drove me bonkers.
Yeah, I mean, I get it, but I always felt like I would stream one thing into the next thing and it would never work. I would always have to write some compatibility layer between the dream of just streaming 7 things together was never, ever, ever the case, for me, at least.
Coming back to today's build tools, what about the sort of the trend towards every framework has its own CLI? Now, are those just wrappers around existing tools, or are they providing unique value?
They are mostly wrappers around other tools. When it comes to build systems, I think the value they provide are like conventions in the specific frameworks that they're for. I personally think they're critical for beginners.
Yeah, they make it really easy to get up and running in a project. I'm not sure if they'll have long-term effects of abstracting away those underlying pieces. I don't think so, but it is really nice being able to quickly get up and running with that. And also it makes sharing projects much easier. Like if you have to share a project for reasons like support, like getting support or getting help on something, it's really easy to spin up a project with those tools.
Yeah, I mean, they've become so popular that NPM has roughly built their use case into the CLI in 6 now. So there's NPM Create, which is kind of a better dependency managed version of something like Create React App or Ember CLI. You can kind of create a runner for your framework that runs across NPM Create, but you don't need to install some global dependency to do it. And so they're kind of like fixing some of the rough edges around the NPM side of things when it comes to just needing a global installer that has to be different versions for everything. So you can NPM Create React App, and there's a space there now, and then that can run all the same code, but in a nicer, non-global way. So I think they're becoming so popular that we're getting first-class support for it in our baseline tooling.
Part of me is wonders if your framework is so complex to need its own CLI. Maybe it's too complex, but just gonna throw that out there.
Well, complexity has to live somewhere if you're writing a complex UI. So you can choose to put that at the framework layer, or you can choose to put that at the application layer. And I think there are good use cases for both, but I don't think the complexity goes away. If you don't need those things to use your framework, but then you have to write a 500,000 line code base, you probably end up having to write those tools or put those tools together yourself. And there are a lot of customizations that you can do to make it specifically better for your use cases, and that's nice. But I don't think it shouldn't always be necessary to need to think about all those things. I think a lot of people's FUD is that they long for the days where you could just write JavaScript in a file and then load a page and it worked. And I understand that, especially from a beginner standpoint, that if you don't have to know about the history and release cycles and stages of TC39 specifications in order to write JavaScript, then that's probably better.
Jared asked a pretty good question in the chat, which is, is there going to be a Webpack killer, or is Webpack going to stay the cutting edge? I know when Parcel first came out and it was saying, zero config module bundling, it zoomed up to like 15,000 stars on GitHub in like a month. But I feel like with Webpack 4, they've kind of mitigated that, and I'm not hearing as much there. So what do you all think? Is there going to be a Webpack killer, or is Webpack going to stay on the bleeding edge?
I assume the Webpack killer already exists. It might be Metro, which is the React native bundler, which does a lot of the same things but way faster, but a lot fewer things. But it's pretty impressive. I think something like that will get adapted and picked up.
I've always felt like Webpack was really low level, and it would make sense to me for there to be tools built on top of it that would be much easier to use. But Angular CLI is built on Webpack, isn't it?
They use Webpack. Vue CLI extends Webpack. I know I've been using Nuxt.js, which is a Vue framework recently, and they hide away the Webpack config under their own config. So they're setting up Webpack for you, and you can get access to it if you absolutely need to, but there's no direct configuration. So they're kind of building on top as well.
That's roughly what Create React App does. It'll allow you to more or less just pipe right into it. But to do anything complex, you have to eject. And in order to run your app, you don't have to write anything at all if you don't want to.
So what is the definition of eject?
Eject just means you can no longer easily pull the latest updates from Create React App. It means you've changed something sufficiently enough. It really, specifically what it does is it stops using the dependencies to pull in configuration, and it starts using your configuration. But because of that, you can't necessarily update the library, the builder anymore, the Create React app, because it doesn't know what's in your configuration file and may no longer support that in a future version. It's kind of the problem is that once you add a significant amount to your configuration, there's no way that they could anticipate breaking changes and things like that. So it's kind of a mechanism around that. So for simple apps, I absolutely encourage everyone to not eject if you can, and just track it. But any significant application that you're working on, like at work or something like that, probably going to need to eject eventually.
This feels like an area that has been evolving very rapidly. I think a lot of that spurred by the adoption of modules formally in JavaScript. And more recently, it seems like there's a little bit more convergence. It's feeling a little bit easier to manage. Do you all feel like this is going to continue to be a big innovation area, or is it calming down and something where build tooling is going to become well solved and more or less disappear from something we have to worry about?
Build tooling never goes away. I don't think we've seen that anywhere in any other older ecosystem, but it becomes for different things. Like we take minification and concatenation for granted these days, whereas like back when I was first starting, I had to run some Java program in order to minify my code, some Yahoo thing I whatever. And so I think it just changes, like the transpilation becomes transparent or something like that. And a new, only load what you need type stuff becomes the build du jour.
I wonder if it's going to move away from the CLI. Maybe you're going to have more servers or something that do this stuff for you. Yeah,
it would be cool to be in a world where you could have like a render farm for your JavaScript build stuff, right? You press a button and 9,200 AWS servers all calculate one equation and send it back the results.
I mean, you deploy your JavaScript and the server takes care of all that crap for you, and you don't have to think about it. That'd be cool.
I mean, that's already what like CI servers do, but you still have to run it locally generally to develop it.
Hey everyone, I'm Tim Smith, senior producer here at Changelog. You know how important it is to stay in the know, and our weekly newsletter helps you and thousands of other developers do exactly that. It's the developer news that matters, nothing more and nothing less. Visit changelog.com and subscribe today.
We were talking a little bit and realized we should really talk a little bit about the module wars and what has become of that, where that's going, what's happened there. So who wants to lead off on talking about System.js or Require.js or any of those fun topics?
Well, I'm not sure which appeared. Does anybody know if Require.js and that AMD kind of showed up before Browserify? I don't recall.
I think that it spun out of CommonJS, which is what Browserify is.
CommonJS was just it wasn't just the one module spec. It was a set of specifications. Both the CommonJS modules that we know, the node style modules, and AMD were CommonJS specs. They were written around the same time, but Require.js was very similar to what Dojo had already done for years. It would just worked without eval.
The difference there being that Require.js or AMD is asynchronous and CommonJS or Node Require, and what Browserify used is synchronous.
Right. The CommonJS modules as we know them are synchronous and require a build in order to run them on the web. And the case for AMD asynchronous module definitions was that by default, the AMD modules did not need a build tool, and I have an article on my blog that everyone can go back and read from whatever year that was. I think the default standards for things, and neither ended up becoming a standard, or at least by any definition of standard that like browsers implementing it. But I think you shouldn't be required to run a build tool in order to use JavaScript or whatever, if that makes sense. It was a nice feature before.
Yeah, that was one of the really big benefits of AMD and why it was so nice, because you didn't have to do anything. It was just running the vanilla JavaScript files during development, and that wasn't slow for local development. So it was really nice and easy to get started with that.
Yeah, but on the other hand, like everyone would run a build tool against their AMD anyways in order to ship it. So I understand the other argument that's like, well, if we're all actually using build tools, maybe it doesn't matter. I just didn't like that it locked you into like using Node, which was not like a guaranteed thing that anyone was even allowed to run at their work at this time. Like most people were not allowed to run Node or couldn't run Node at their jobs at the time when this was happening. And so it was somewhat frustrating as a web developer that we were kind of standardizing on Node as the only build tool.
Do you think that's been more or less decided at this point? Like, is anyone still using AMD or any of these things?
Plenty of libraries still use tools to output in AMD and UMD, as it's called. There was a project called BestDJS with Matthias and what's his name? Lodash creator. Oh my goodness. One of my favorite people.
John David Dalton.
JDD. John David Dalton. And they put out something called UMD, which is the Universal Module Definition, and it would kind of try to detect the module system that you used and give you the right thing. So it was AMD and CommonJS and whatever old things, Window. And so people use tools in order to just export their modules as UMD, and so anyone can use them. I think that's fine. I also think people can do that to your modules. I think you either do UMD or nothing, and either of those is fine.
Let's move on to looking at things like Prettier and linting tools and flow and all of this. It feels like JavaScript is becoming a lot more formalized as a language in a lot of ways. What are y'all using and what do you recommend?
So as we discussed last week, I'm using TypeScript, which does kind of go in the opposite way and force you into a build for everything. So the complete opposite of what Alex was saying. As a good starting point, but that's trading off to give me a bunch more helpful tooling during development, I think. And we discussed that last week.
Yeah, I'm not against having build tooling. I'm just against requiring it as part of the JavaScript standard. So TypeScript is not the JavaScript standard, but if you want to use TypeScript, then by all means add the build tool. I add the flow build tool to my chain, but I just don't want to force other people to do that.
Yeah, so I used to use JSHint and JSCS in pretty much everything until I saw that I could do the same stuff pretty much with just ESLint, and so I've been using it ever since. I know the JSCS team, I believe, actually joined the ESLint project, and so kind of like ESLint absorbed everything JSCS was doing, and so if you're not aware, JSCS I think that stands for JavaScript code style or something. It was not a formatter, but it would, I believe, it would just spout out errors and warnings if the code wasn't formatted a certain way.
Yeah, they both became jQuery Foundation projects, and then later JS Foundation projects whenever the jQuery Foundation moved over. And because of that, that was somewhat of a nice move to pick up both of them. JSCS was losing steam and losing contributors, and so the JS Foundation somewhat facilitated kind of the joining of those projects. I kind of wish Prettier and ESLint were the same thing, though, at this point.
I do as well.
Does anyone not use Prettier these days? I don't. It was one of the most quickly picked up projects I've seen, mostly I think because, like, kind of by definition, if you have like valid JavaScript, it just runs and then it's over. So it can be somewhat hard to put against an old code base or get people to adopt on your team, but like as far as running it, it's like once you have it set up, it just runs. So it's kind of nice in that like it's not deeply integrated. It's hugely important and runs on everything and changes a lot of things, but it doesn't have a lot of dependencies, if that makes sense.
I have a couple projects that don't have Prettier in just because they weren't part of the template that I started from, and I didn't bother, but I should go back and put them in because it's essentially free and it removes a whole class of problems.
I don't even agree with all of the stuff, like pretty adamantly think that some of the choices they make are wrong, but it's just worth, like, I can still type them wrong and Prettier will change them whenever I do a commit or whatever.
Yeah, I'm in the same boat. I don't really care for some of its choices, but I feel like the benefits outweigh the disadvantages, and I'm using it on everything that I can. From we just actually merged Prettier. Now we're using it in Mocha, and we did that just a couple weeks ago.
I'm curious how you all get set up with these tools. Like when you're starting a new project, do you just kind of have global ESLint RCs and Prettier RCs that you copy in, or I can never remember all of the rules between all of the different ones for setting up the file just the way I want it. I'm curious how you handle that.
I manually copy files from the most recent project that I worked on before.
At Stripe, we have a repo, and I think we might even have a published module, or maybe it's private. I don't know. But yeah, we can just pull that in, and then you, just like you might pull in Airbnb's defaults for ESLint and Prettier, Stripe, you can make your own pretty easily in the same way. You can even extend Airbnbs and just change a few things. So I would encourage everyone to do that, even if it's just a local GitHub thing.
Yeah, I start from the Airbnb and then rip out the ones that drive me bonkers.
Yeah, Mocha's using semi-standard, and then it's
Don't tell for us.
Yeah, well. Yeah. Anyway, so it's using that, and then there's some modifications. We had some actually. This is why I love ESLint is because we have a situation where you're a test runner, you want to be able to run async code, so you want to be able to do things in a set timeout in your own code base. But the problem is if a tool like Sign-On or whatever comes along and it wants to use its fake timers and change things, and so essentially makes async things synchronous, well, you don't want your you don't want that to affect the test framework. And so in order to avoid that, you have to actually avoid use of global timers. So you can't use set timeout. You can't use the global clear timeout. And so what you do is before you load that stuff, before you load the test, you essentially just create a reference to the global set timeout. And so you pass that around and you can use that in Mocha and not have to worry about somebody else blowing it away. And so I was able to use ESLint to create some like fancy custom rules to disallow use of like this handful of globals, but also allow references to be made. And so, yeah, that's cool. And I think that's part of the reason why they even, why ESLint was made, just to be able to create custom rules like that. It's awesome.
Mocha makes for a good transition. What sorts of testing tools are we using?
I guess I'm kind of curious about, especially like, what are people using for functional tests nowadays?
I think as much as possible, we're trying not to write functional tests. There are like a set of, and I think also that gets bigger or less because of everyone has different definitions of exactly the borders of functional testing. But when I talk about functional testing, I mean like you pretty much serve your application and have a browser, like you use something like the Click, what are they called? There's a Java tool that runs against Chrome. Selenium. Like Selenium has some subdependency that I'm trying to think of. But
Chrome driver?
Yeah, Chrome driver is an implementation of it, but yeah.
WebDriver support.
Yeah, WebDriver, that's what it is. So WebDriver is an actual standardized API that all the browsers are supposed to implement and kind of do. But those are so slow and so hard to write in a way that doesn't make them super flaky, that as much as possible doing like jest and enzyme style, like render this in, without a browser and then click the things and check the handlers. That's absolutely like 90% of Stripe's thoughts on writing these tests. We still want some end-to-end things, right? Just like logging in works and doing these different things work, especially whenever there's servers involved. You don't want mocked endpoints and things like that. But we try to keep those to a minimum. Just because they're kind of a nightmare to maintain.
Yeah, I mean, my experience with those types of... Basically, when I say functional test, I mean you're scripting a browser. And so, my experience has been those types of tests are, A, difficult to write, B, difficult to not write in a flaky way, and, C, a maintenance nightmare, and in the end, it's just expensive. It's expensive as a business to invest in functional tests, and at some point you have to decide. Is it worth it for what we're doing? I don't know. That's a tough question. And there's tools. I'm curious about Cypress.io. I haven't used it, and then what I understand, it's an alternative to like the whole Selenium thing.
I also think as developers, we tend to undervalue the value of QA teams and having people who actually go through and use this thing as users, not even scripted browsers, which is the epitome of expensive. But when I've worked with a good QA team, like they catch things that I never would have thought of.
But on the other hand, it can be difficult to so I remember trying to hire people to write functional tests, and that was a nightmare because anybody who could write these tests and write them well probably didn't want to be a QA engineer and wanted to actually write, the code. And so that was a really difficult position to hire for. And maybe that's just the way things are.
Yeah, I think it is.
We as an industry put this idea that QA is less than engineering. And I think, honestly, that's a mistake, right? QA is a fascinating problem set that is very different. We should be playing it up as something that is very different from engineering, but that for the right type of person is an awesome career.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it just needs to be framed differently. But anyway, I guess that's a can of worms.
To some extent, one thing Stripe does very well is almost nothing releases to everyone all at once. We kind of ramp anything up to 1% or 10 users first, and this is like testing in production or whatever. But to some extent, like if you're reasonably well tested, otherwise we write a ton of tests. We have coverage tools, all that kind of stuff that measure that stuff. But also we never assume things are going to work, even from like a UX standpoint right out of the gate. And so every once in a while like we'll release it to 5% of people, and that's enough to get a few reports that's like, well, on my browser in IE, this pop-up never goes away or whatever. And that's at least more acceptable in my eyes than sending it out to everyone that way, but never as fun to be the person whose pop-up won't go away.
You mentioned Jest and Enzyme, and so what I guess I'm curious about, so that does not run in a browser, right?
Correct.
You're testing your React app that is going to run in a browser, and so is the idea there that it's just not necessary, or it's nice to run it in a browser, but it's really just too expensive and all the problems we were just talking about?
Yeah, so it uses JS DOM, so it's using a browser by some definition of a browser that it just doesn't need interactions, because you aren't, like, you're simulating clicks on DOM nodes you already have handles on, rather than like clicking on like an X coordinate on the page. And that's kind of like the difference. You don't have X coordinates, you don't have a window, that can actually be clicked. So things are faked. You get, synthetic events instead of real events. But I think for the most part, you can test that changes occur. So if someone clicks on this, you want to make sure that this new content exists, or if someone clicks on these three things, you want to make sure that this thing is now available for them to see. I think for the most part, in like logic, they're like somewhere between unit tests and functional tests. Like they're testing functionality of like clicking through the application, but they're not really clicking through the application. I just think with our current tooling, maybe one day, functional testing will be fast and easy and stuff. But there is no flakiness, essentially. Like comparatively, there is obviously flakiness in any testing, depending on how you write it. But comparatively, the quality of tests that we get and their ability to like actually catch things, this is much better, because people actually try to fix the tests if they break, rather than just assume they're flaky and turn them off.
Hey everyone, I'm Tim Smith, senior producer at Changelog. We're so excited to have added the React podcast to our stellar lineup of shows. Every week, Michael Jackson has conversations with developers doing great things in the world of React. You'll hear from people like Andrew Clark, a developer on the React core team at Facebook.
I'm here on the podcast to talk about the thing that I spend most of my time thinking and dreaming and fantasizing and worrying about, which is React, because that is what I do all day, every day. Even when I don't want to.
James Long, who was frustrated with budgeting apps, so he decided to build his own called Actual with React and Electron.
The UI design is just super overcomplicated in so many of the apps out there. You look at some of the screenshots of these apps and there's like 50 numbers on the screen. The simplest question that you want to answer is what I just said, right? What is my finances right now? Should I buy this thing that's $200? Like, can I buy this PS4? Like, how much is that going to hurt me?
Or Henry Zhu. Henry quit his job and is working on open source full time.
I think overall, I feel pretty good about it, for sure. There's definitely lots of unknowns and things I have to work out, whether it's just like personally or logistically, all that stuff. But I'm definitely excited for what's in store.
Go to changelog.com/React podcast or wherever you listen to our shows. New episodes come out every Tuesday.
Let's circle into another part of the testing cycle, which is continuous integration and how you run tests automatically and maybe even lay things out to staging and production environments. Alex, I know you said you're using a lot of CI tools, or at least some CI tools at Stripe. Do you want to lead us in with what you're doing?
Yeah, sure. I also do a lot of open source work, or I used to do more, but plenty of CI involved in that too. So you kind of have some different options. At Stripe, we use Jenkins, which is a pretty like self-service, large CI thing that like a whole team needs to run, but is good for that. And then there are also like hosted solutions like Travis CI or Circle CI, different ones like that. The ones that you'll see, like the cute little green or red badges on the top of people's GitHub READMEs. I think if you have a smaller project, really bordering up into pretty large, the hosted things can can do well for you. But once you need kind of things behind your own VPN or behind, start spinning up staging servers in AWS as part of it, or need to scale to hundreds of people building, then you start needing to do something like run your own Jenkins cluster. But I think CI in the open source world is pretty different than CI in the business world, and I think the business world does it pretty well. And I think the needs are different. I don't think it's like a lack of understanding. With open source, I feel like we run tests, maybe run tests against a few different versions of Node, something like that, and then occasionally build assets will be done at the CI level. But actually, in open source JavaScript, usually it's just done at the deploy. Like whenever you ship a new version, you like pull a headless branch out and commit a dist file with a force flag or whatever. I think that's more common than CI actually doing the building. So it's interesting that like CI in the open source world is almost entirely testing, in my experience. In the business world, it's almost like it runs the tests, but that's like the first step. It also runs all the builds. It also helps facilitate QA or staging or any of those different things. So anytime I submit a PR at Stripe, we'll spin up a server will be ready to kind of pick it up, build the whole thing. It'll even spin up AWS servers that can run that branch. And then the bot will come in with a link to like a usable instance of the application running against my pull request. There's a massive amount of stuff that you can do at the CI layer to like send off resources, send requests, caching, make everything fast, split everything up. I think all of Stripe runs a monorepo, and I think all of our tests run, sub 15 minutes, sub 10 minutes sometimes, depending on the changes, which is long, I understand, for most people, but like it's, thousands and thousands of tests. Some of them are functional tests, some of, JavaScript, Ruby, Go, all of that stuff is all running at once. So there are like, probably, several workers running different parts. And we even like do things like time all the tests, and all the tests should be idempotent from each other, whatever. And then the workers can split up the certain tests into different boxes in order to balance the workers for the next run. And so you can kind of do all these sorts of things to really like eke out every bit of performance and value out of them. And it's absolutely critical to our workflow.
And you said that somewhere you said something about how it needs a whole team, meaning you need a whole team to maintain it and configure it, or?
I mean, there's that. I don't think that's what they're doing all the time. They're building new integrations, making things faster, maybe pulling in different tools. We have a team at Stripe, I believe, called Developer Productivity, and they work on everything from those bots that automatically spin up development environment servers for PRs, and quickly it'll happen in like less than a few minutes after posting the PR, which is amazing. Like you no longer have to put like a bunch of screenshots and explanations. You'd be like, here, go to the link that the bot automatically posted and use the actual thing that I made and tell me if it works. That is so great.
Yeah, I would have loved something like that, like 5 years ago.
The same team is going to be working on like making sure Jira is up and running, and making sure our GitHub Enterprise is up and running, and all of those are like working smoothly together. But I think a good chunk of their time is like making sure builds are like, if a build goes down, if you think about like there are some, a few hundred developers at Stripe now. If our build system goes down or becomes slow or has failures in the master branch to where you can't get out deploys, like it's a multi hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of engineer time that you just lost, and momentum and all sorts of things get pushed back. So it's vitally important at Stripe scale, which isn't even that big when it comes to like number of developers compared to like Facebook or something like that, that this stuff is running like extremely smoothly. It's considered an incident. Like if we go down, that's an incident at Stripe. Of course, never happens. That's an incident. But also if the builds go down for longer than, a minute or two at a time, that's also considered like an equal incident.
So you mentioned the difference between, CI in open source and CI in business. And I kind of wonder, some of that is driven by the fact that open source rarely has teams to dedicate to that. But Chris, how are you using CI for Mocha?
So we're running CI on Travis CI, and we're running it on App there. We found, there's some weirdness that will happen on Windows, and so we wanted to make sure that we were getting coverage there. And so every PR runs through like 4 versions of Node. On Travis, it runs browser tests, it runs linting. I've actually I got a self-promotion. I got a recent blog post all about some changes that we made to our Travis config that are pretty neat if you're looking to like min-max your Travis build or whatever. But and then app there runs just a couple versions of Node. We don't double up on like lint checks or whatever. We don't have app there launch its own set of browser tests because that doesn't make sense. But that's basically how we do it. And, I agree. I haven't seen a whole lot of deployment happening from open source projects. Usually, the world I'm in, if deployment means you publish to NPM, when that does happen in CI, it seems to happen with like semantic release, if you're familiar with that tool. So there is like an artifact that we publish like an artifact to S3, or maybe a handful of them, which are the bundles created by Karma. So we run our browser tests with Karma, and so we basically take the like browserified, Karma-fied test bundle and upload that to S3 if we need to debug it. And haven't had to use that for quite a while, ever since we dropped support for IE 9 or IE 8. Because that was really a nightmare to debug. I would log into Sauce Labs because we run them through Sauce Labs, and you could get into like IE8, but you couldn't really see a stack trace. You'd get like a line number, and so you couldn't see the code, and so I'd had to go back and actually look at the bundle and match up the line number, and so that's what that was for. But yeah, I would say most, at least in Node land, are not deploying much of anything.
All right, let's move forward to our next set of tooling. I want to make sure that we have time to cover IDEs, because this is... there's been a lot of progress in the last couple years. I think between GitHub's Atom and the new round of Microsoft VS Code, like there's a ton of innovation happening in the IDE space. So maybe let's start with what IDE are you all using?
Well, as you foreshadowed in the wrap at the beginning, I'm just using Vim, just terminal Vim. But I do get a lot of the benefits for my TypeScript code through TS Server and through various plugins. I think I have 65 plugins right now. So maybe I'm going a little overboard, but I can do modern development in Vim.
What plugin manager do you use for Vim?
Vim plug.
Interesting. More of a pathogen user myself.
I was using that, but I like being able to just go and comment things out in my vimrc and turn that off rather than having to manage like Git submodules.
Yeah, I always used, I use VS Code now for what it's worth, but I still set up my Vim as if I'm going to use it. I still use it sometimes. But yeah, I always use SPF 13 as a good starting point in case anyone needs one. Just like if you want to try Vim, it's going to be pretty difficult to use out of the box. That's just one of its features. But if you like install SPF 13, it'll install all the tools that we all install into our Vim anyways. Maybe it might, pick a side on some holy war of autocomplete. But it's a pretty good starting point if you want some plugins.
I'm using VS Code now. I switched a couple of months ago. I had been using first PyCharm and then WebStorm for, 5 years or something. And so, I thought I'd try VS Code because I saw everybody who's like giving presentations is using VS Code, and there's got to be something to it, and people seem to rave about it, so I tried it, and I liked it. So there's still some parts of it that bug me, but it works well. It's quick.
I use Vim Mode Plus with overrides in VS Code, and I roughly have everything I really, really cared about from my Vim config, which is always the problem with Vim modes in different, in TextMate or whatever back in the day, is you couldn't customize it at all. Like you could do baseline Vim stuff, but everyone uses JJ or, different Control P plugins, different things like that. And so I was able to get my VS Code working to where all the things I naturally did, :WQ to save, all that kind of stuff. But also, like, if you need to click around, you can click around too. It's kind of, in my opinion, best of both worlds at this moment. But I wasn't like an extreme power user of Vim. I was just regular good at it.
VS Code feels fast until you start trying to do a bunch of Vim macros in it, and then you're like, oh, this is so slow.
Same with Vim, though.
Well, yeah, I've started using VS Code explicitly for demos and for recording stuff because it is pretty, and it makes it, folks are used to seeing it, but I'm still down in, I've been like trying to migrate to more of a full IDE for forever, and I just always end up back in Vim. I'm very much a terminal guy. I live in my terminal. I've got a Tmux set up with Vim, shortcuts and everything. So my terminal and my editor are basically the same thing. It's really hard to get out of.
Yeah, I'm in the same boat. I'm actually using NeoVim in the terminal and in Tmux, and I really like that setup. But there are things that I'm really envious of in VS Code that I just could never get in Vim, in terminal Vim. Some of the new things with like collaboration just look so cool. I've always had this dream of being able to use Tmux for that, but in reality, nobody knows how to navigate my Vim but me, so it doesn't work like that. They also like allow you to share dev environments through VS Code, which is really, really cool. And then the integrated debugging.
Do you use Vim or NeoVim?
I use NeoVim.
I'm just on old school Vim. I need to check out NeoVim. What's the benefit?
I think it's rewritten in a more modern language. I can't remember even which one. Not everything is supported, but the things that are supported are faster and safer and stuff. But also, I think it's more externally scriptable. I think you can actually run Vim mode powered by NeoVim in the background. I think that might be how I have it set up. So like certain things actually run against NeoVim, like the runtime, and then come back into VS Code. I think I had to provide my NeoVim location for some reason, at least.
Yeah, I think I've read about that. That's really cool. NeoVim gives you, the initial benefit was that it had async job support, so your Syntactic or whatever could run without blocking the loop in the editor and freezing the editor while it was doing that. And it also had an integrated terminal, but Vim 8 has both of those now. So
it also had better color support, and you didn't have to write Vim script.
Yeah, it looks like you can write scripts in Lua.
Yeah, I think it's Lua. Yeah.
I've tried to keep my setup pretty portable between the two, but the way that it currently is, after a couple hours of using regular Vim, I'll get a Stack Overflow error. I don't get that in NeoVim, so I haven't tried Vim 8.1 or whatever the latest just came out. But
yeah, I just aliased Vim to NVim at this point, so I think I'm fully over to NeoVim. But again, I don't commonly use it anymore, so I think it's good. Like if you don't commonly use it, just switch over now. That way you don't accidentally lock yourself into something that doesn't work.
All right, so we've probably lost all the JavaScript folks because we're talking about Vim for a while, but good to know that we're all on the same page here. Anything else or last things we want to touch on before we wrap up?
How about Yarn?
Oh, Yarn.
My opinion, we use Yarn at Stripe. Yarn is one of those things that's going to work fine for you if you work against it. Enough people are using it to where it's good. I think it motivates the NPM team to speed some things up, and I think it's roughly good to have the competition or whatever, but also like don't feel like you're missing out on something great. I think especially like npm 6 has great features that Yarn doesn't have as well.
Is it going to go the IOJS route where they diverge for a while and eventually make good and remerge?
That doesn't seem to be how Facebook does things. I think Facebook will dig their heels in and build more things that are custom to just them, if history serves us right. But generally, they're pretty decent tools.
I like Yarn because of, just for what you said, because it helps push NPM forward. NPM had a lot of big changes after Yarn showed up, and I tend to just use NPM, like if I'm starting a project, but I use whatever file I see. Whatever lock file I see.
Lock files were a massive improvement to the entire ecosystem. The shrink wrap was a nightmare in the past. And I think a lot of like criticism of Yarn was that, like, of course it's fast. It only does, 1/8 of what NPM does and doesn't ensure any of these things. And the feedback I think that was heard was like, well, most of the time, most people are only doing this 1/8 of things. And so it wasn't so much that like the code for Yarn was just brilliant compared to the code for NPM. I think there's a lot of like just like folklore, but Yarn does a lot less than NPM does, and I think it was motivating to the team to just like streamline that like most common use case, and I think they have done a great job speed wise. Is great.
Chris, you want to chime in?
No, I mean I pretty much use NPM. The only thing I ran into with Yarn was that it had some issues. You like had to pass a special flag or something to it, or else you could run into problems if you're trying to run it in two places at once.
Mutex, stuff.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, for me, I don't really know what the real value proposition is anymore. Given that now NPM has all this other stuff. But yeah, I mean, it doesn't seem like anything that's necessarily going to bite you in the rear for choosing it.
They have kind of versions of the same thing, like pulling in packages from local file system or things like that, like work slightly different, or the way the lock files store things are slightly different. Like one is deterministic and one isn't. Or maybe that is no longer true, but there are trade-offs, speed for consistency or various things like that. But I don't think they're large. I think whatever you use now, if you're happy with it, use it. If it's broken, try the other one, and if it works, use that. And keep doing that for the rest of your life. They're completely interchangeable from a runtime standpoint. Like if you know one, it's pretty easy to use the other.
Just don't use Bower.
Don't use Bower. And that's a perfect place to end. Don't use Bower. All right. So this has been JS Party talking about tooling. If you're listening to this on podcast, you should join us live every Thursday. Though the time keeps jumping around, it's usually 10 a.m. Pacific, except when we want to have Alex. And then it drops down to 9. That's it for this week's JS Party, and we'll catch you next week.
All right, thank you for tuning in to JS Party this week. Tune in live on Thursdays at 1 p.m. U.S. Eastern at changelog.com/live. Join the community and Slack with us in real time during the shows. Head to changelog.com/community. And do us a favor, share this show with a friend, rate us on Apple Podcast, go into Overcast and favorite it. And thank you to Fastly, our bandwidth partner. Head to fastly.com to learn more. And we move fast and fix things around here at Changelog because of Rollbar. Check them out at rollbar.com. We're hosted on Linode Cloud servers. Head to linode.com/changelog. Check them out and support this show. Our music is produced by Breakmaster Cylinder, and you can find more shows just like this at changelog.com. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next week.